Hey viewers! Hope you're all doing great. Before I start the story, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy my videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Saladin, the Muslim warrior who defeated the West. Listen. Can you hear the wind of Damascus brushing against the domes of forgotten mosques? It carries the name of a man whispered through centuries. Al-ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West simply as Saladin. A hero to some, a conqueror to others. A shadow that moved between two worlds, the East and the West, during one of the most violent and devout centuries in human history. The name Saladin has become almost mythic. Born in 1137 or 1138 in Tikrit, Iraq, he lived at the crossroads of faith and empire. His rise marked not only the revival of Islamic unity after decades of internal division, but also the reshaping of the Crusades themselves. For nearly a century before his birth, Europe's crusading armies had carved out fragile Christian kingdoms in the heart of the Middle East: Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa. But those kingdoms were surrounded by powerful Muslim lands, fractured by politics yet united by faith. Out of that fractured world came a young Kurdish officer who would become the symbol of courage, mercy, and relentless purpose. Saladin, the Sultan who would take back Jerusalem without drowning it in blood. Picture it now. The 12th century. The desert breathes under a merciless sun. Caravans cross the wastes between Baghdad and Cairo, carrying silk, spices, and stories. But the old caliphate, once mighty under Harun al-Rashid, has crumbled into smaller states. The Abbasid caliphs still sit in Baghdad, but their power is a shadow. Real control lies in the hands of warlords, emirs, and viziers. Meanwhile, in the distant west, Europe is aflame with zeal. The Crusades, launched from the call of Pope Urban II in 1095, have brought tens of thousands of knights to the Holy Land. They built fortresses upon hills and towers over sacred valleys. In 1099, Jerusalem fell to them. The blood of its defenders, Muslim and Jewish alike, flowed knee-deep through its streets. The world of Islam trembled. But history has a rhythm, and in that rhythm balance always returns. Before Saladin, there was Nur ad-Din Zangi, a ruler of rare piety and discipline. He dreamed of uniting Syria and Egypt under one banner to resist the Crusaders. It was under his command that Saladin first served. Saladin's father Ayyub and his uncle Shirkuh were Kurdish officers in Zangi's army. When Saladin was a boy, his world was filled with the sound of hooves, the clatter of armor, and the call to prayer rising over dusty camps. He learned early that faith and war were twins in the age he lived in, and both demanded sacrifice. At 26, he followed his uncle Shirkuh to Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate, a Shura state ruling from Cairo, was collapsing from within. The Crusaders sought to exploit this weakness. Nur ad-Din sent Shirkuh to intervene, and with him went Saladin, quiet and observant, still far from the legend he would become. Imagine the scene. Cairo in 1169. A city of mosques and gardens, but also of intrigue. The Fatimid Caliph Alid is dying. His ministers at war with one another. After Shirkuh's sudden death, Saladin, almost reluctantly, is appointed vizier, a post few believed he could hold. He was young, modest, and unknown. But within months, his quiet resolve began to reshape Egypt. He abolished corrupt taxes. He replaced the Shura call to prayer with a Sunni one, signaling loyalty to Baghdad and to Nur ad-Din. He built schools, strengthened the army, and, in 1171, formally ended the Fatimid Caliphate, restoring Egypt to Sunni Islam. It was one of the great political transformations of the medieval world. From that moment, Saladin became more than a general. He became a symbol of unity. But destiny is never quiet. Nur ad-Din died in 1174, and the dream of a unified front against the Crusaders trembled. Rival emirs fought for control of Syria. Egypt's wealth made it the prize. Saladin acted swiftly. He marched north, not as a conqueror but as a restorer of order. By diplomacy, marriage, and war, He brought Damascus under his rule, then Aleppo, Hama, and Homs, the banners of the Ayyubid dynasty. His family's line rose above the gates of the old Zengid fortresses. Soon, nearly all of Syria and Egypt bowed to his authority. He was now sultan of a vast and restless realm, the only Muslim power strong enough to challenge the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. Now picture the land stretching between Cairo and Acre, fields of olive and wheat, broken by stone fortresses, each one a Crusader outpost. Carrick, Montreal, Tiberias. These were not peaceful men within. They were the descendants of Europe's warrior nobility, hardened by heat and faith. Among them ruled King Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, young, noble, and tragically diseased. He fought Saladin with courage even as his body failed him. 4 years they tested one another in skirmishes and truces, never fully at peace, never at full war. But within the Crusader ranks grew a dangerous faction led by Reynold de Chatillon, a reckless lord who despised every treaty. He attacked Muslim caravans even during truces, slaughtered pilgrims, and swore to take Mecca itself. Saladin's patience, though vast, began to crack. By 1186, the fragile peace had died. King Baldwin was gone. His sister Sibylla and her husband Guy de Lusignan now ruled. Reynold struck again, this time seizing a caravan that carried Saladin's own sister. That single act would light the fire of one of the greatest battles in medieval history. Saladin called the faithful to jihad, not for vengeance but for justice. Across Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, soldiers gathered under his green banner, their armor shining beneath the desert sun. Drums rolled through Damascus. Poets sang of Jerusalem. The year 1187 would decide the fate of the Holy Land. And so, with faith in his heart and history at his side, Saladin marched toward the horns of Hattin, where the west would meet the east beneath a burning sky. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the heat rising from the earth, shimmering like a ghost above the stones. It is the summer of 1187. The fields around Lake Tiberias are dry and brittle. To the west lies Acre, glittering on the coast. To the east, beyond the dust, rise 2 bare hills, twin cones of basalt known as the Horns of Hattin. There, under the merciless July sun, Saladin and the Crusader armies would meet in battle. A battle that would decide not just the fate of Jerusalem, but the balance between east and west for centuries to come. Saladin's army stretched across the land like a living tide. Chroniclers speak of 30,000 men, infantry and cavalry drawn from Egypt, Syria, Mosul, and the Hejaz. Their banners rippled green and gold beneath the light, marked with verses from the Quran. They were soldiers, yes, but also pilgrims, men who believed their struggle was holy, their cause divine. On the other side, King Guy de Lusignan led around 20,000 crusaders. Among them rode the proud Templars and Hospitallers, Europe's most feared knights, armored from head to heel in iron, carrying the Red Cross of Christ. Yet they were weary. They had marched from Acre through scorching plains, following Reynold's recklessness. Their throats cracked from thirst. The wells were few, and every one of them lay under Saladin's control. Saladin had planned the field with precision. He knew the land, its winds, its heat, its cruel thirst. He ordered his men to block every spring and to set fire to the dry grass ahead of the Crusaders. Smoke rolled across the plain, stinging their eyes, choking their lungs. The Christian knights advanced blindly, the sun blazing above them, dust and ash swirling around. By the time they reached the slopes of Hattin, their strength was broken. Horses staggering, armor searing hot. Saladin's men encircled them. From every direction came the whistle of arrows, dark clouds raining from the sky. Drums beat like thunder. Trumpets of war echoed across the desert hills. Through the haze, King Guy's banners fluttered desperately, surrounded by chaos. The Templars tried to break through the encirclement, charging again and again into the Saracen lines. But each time, they were swallowed by the tide of horsemen. The battle turned into slaughter. The Muslim chronicler Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who was with Saladin, wrote, The Franks were overwhelmed by the heat and the thirst. Their horses dropped dead. Their ranks melted like wax before the fire. By afternoon, the Crusader camp was surrounded. The true cross, the sacred relic they carried into battle, was captured. Smoke rose high from the burning grass. And in the midst of it all, King Guy and Reynold were taken alive. That night, in Saladin's tent, the two prisoners were brought before him. Guy trembled with exhaustion, his face grey with dust. Reynold stood defiant, the man who had broken every truce and sworn to raid Mecca itself. Saladin offered King Guy a cup of cool water. Guy drank, and then passed the cup to Reynold. But Saladin stopped him. "It is not I who gave him drink," he said quietly. "That was your gift, not mine." Then Saladin turned to Reynold. He reminded him of his crimes, the murdered pilgrims, the broken treaties. And when Reynold refused to repent, Saladin struck him down himself, an act not of cruelty, but of justice in that age's eyes. To King Guy, however, he showed mercy. The king would live, a captive, a witness to his army's fall. By sunset, the plain was silent. Tens of thousands of crusaders lay dead or captured. Of the Templars and Hospitallers, almost none remained alive. Saladin spared only the clerics and the poor. He ordered the captured knights treated according to their rank. Many later ransomed, others imprisoned. When the news reached the coastal cities, Acre, Tyre, Tripoli, panic spread like wildfire. The mighty Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, built over nearly a century, was broken in a single day. Saladin moved swiftly. One fortress after another fell. Tiberias, Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon. The road to Jerusalem lay open. It is autumn now in your mind. The heat of Hattin has faded into the golden light of September 1187. Saladin's army, carrying the captured relic of the true cross, advances toward the holy city. Behind its walls stand the remnants of the Crusader garrison, led by Balian of Ibelin, a noble who had escaped the massacre. The people of Jerusalem trembled. Memories of the First Crusade haunted them, when the Christian armies, nearly a century earlier, had taken the city in blood and fire, killing Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians. But this time it would be different. Saladin encamped around the city in late September. He ordered his men not to harm the sacred places. Not a single church or shrine was to be touched. From his tent, he could see the golden dome of the rock glinting in the morning sun, the same dome from which the Prophet Muhammad was said to have ascended to heaven. The siege lasted less than 2 weeks. Saladin's catapults hurled stones against the walls. His archers filled the air with arrows. Inside, the defenders fought bravely but hopelessly. When the outer walls fell, Balian of Ibelin came to Saladin's camp to negotiate surrender. Saladin's terms were clear and merciful. Those who could pay a ransom would go free. Those who could not would be spared and escorted safely out of the city. There would be no massacre. And so, on October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem was surrendered peacefully. At dawn, Saladin entered Jerusalem on foot, not as a conqueror riding in triumph, but as a pilgrim walking humbly before God. He ordered the city cleansed, the dome of the rock purified, and the crescent banner raised once more over its walls. Muslims wept with joy. After nearly 90 years, the third holiest city in Islam was theirs again, and not through vengeance but through justice. The chroniclers wrote that even many Christians wept, not out of fear, but out of awe at the Sultan's restraint. The West had lost Jerusalem, but the story, the great wave of faith and fury, was not yet over. Because across the sea, in Europe, the bells began to toll. Kings and knights would soon swear new vows, and the Third Crusade would rise. The year is 1187, and word of Jerusalem's fall spreads like a storm across Christendom. Monks hurry through monasteries carrying the news. Priests cry out in pulpits, their voices trembling. The holy city has fallen. The sepulchre of Christ is in the hands of the infidel. From Rome to Paris, from London to the German lands, the bells toll in mourning. The West, humiliated and stunned, begins to stir once more. Out of this shock would rise a new wave of crusaders, a tide unlike any before. And waiting for them across the sunlit sands of the east, stood Saladin, calm, patient, and unyielding. Pope Gregory VIII issues a new crusading bull, Audita Tremendi. It is not a cry of revenge, but of penitence. Christians are called to reclaim the holy city through faith and sacrifice. Europe answers. 3 of the mightiest kings of the age take the cross. Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, fierce, proud, and restless for glory. Philip II of France, cunning and pragmatic. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, old but legendary, leading a vast army from the German states. The Third Crusade had begun, a march that would stretch across continents and oceans, and bring East and West face to face in one of the most extraordinary confrontations in medieval history. In the East, Saladin understood what was coming. He was no longer simply the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He was the guardian of the Muslim world's heart. He strengthened the coastal fortresses, garrisoned Jerusalem, and prepared his armies along the plains of Acre and Jaffa. But beyond the battlefields, his rule was guided by something deeper: justice and faith. He rebuilt roads and markets destroyed by years of war. He lowered taxes to restore trade. He even invited Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem under safe passage, ensuring the city remained a place of peace rather than vengeance. The chronicler Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, who served in Saladin's court, wrote, "His mercy was vast, his anger rare, his tongue clean of insult. He held himself as a servant of God, not a master of men." Across the Anatolian mountains, the great Emperor Frederick Barbarossa led nearly 100,000 soldiers. They marched through Hungary, Byzantium, and into the lands of the Seljuks. But fate has its own plans. In 1190, while crossing a river in Cilicia, the old emperor was thrown from his horse and drowned. The mighty German army, shaken and leaderless, turned back. Only a few thousand reached the Holy Land. And so, the great burden of the crusade fell upon the 2 rival kings, Richard of England and Philip of France. Listen. You can almost hear the clang of hammers and the cries of soldiers echoing over the sea. The city of Acre, once a proud crusader port, now in Saladin's hands, had become the focus of the entire war. In 1189, the surviving crusaders laid siege to Acre. Saladin encamped nearby with his own army, surrounding the besiegers. A siege within a siege. For 2 long years, both sides endured hunger, disease, and unrelenting struggle. The sea brought new ships from Europe. From the land came caravans from Cairo and Damascus. The ground trembled with the crash of catapults. By June 1191, the golden banners of England appeared on the horizon. Richard the Lionheart had arrived. Richard was everything his legend claimed: bold, brilliant, and dangerous. He rode at the front of his army, golden hair glinting beneath the Levantine sun. His sword was swift, his temper volcanic. He was no mere pilgrim. He was a king who sought not only to reclaim Jerusalem, but to etch his name in the book of eternal fame. When Philip of France joined him, the Crusaders renewed their assault. After weeks of bloody fighting, Acre finally fell in July 1191. The defenders surrendered under Saladin's orders, hoping for ransom and exchange of prisoners. But Richard, furious at delays and rumors of broken promises, ordered a mass execution of thousands of Muslim captives outside the city walls. It was one of the darkest moments of the crusade. Saladin, though enraged, did not retaliate in kind. He simply strengthened his resolve. After Acre, the Crusaders moved south toward Jaffa, shadowed constantly by Saladin's forces. The summer heat returned, the same merciless sun that had witnessed Hattin. But now the Christians were wiser, their supply lines tighter. On September 7, 1191, near Arsuf, Richard and Saladin clashed in open battle. It was fierce and fast, the Saracen cavalry striking like lightning, the Crusader knights charging in disciplined ranks. Dust and blood mingled in the air. Though Richard's army held the field, it was not a decisive victory. Saladin's troops retreated in perfect order, their morale unbroken. Both men had tested each other, and found in the other a reflection of themselves. Strong, proud, and unwilling to yield. For the next 2 years, war turned into negotiation. Each advance and retreat was followed by letters, envoys, and truces. Richard and Saladin came to respect each other deeply. They exchanged gifts, horses, fruit, medicines, even falcons. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent his own physician and cooling snow from Mount Lebanon. The chroniclers on both sides wrote of a strange bond, an admiration that transcended faith. Never, wrote the Arab historian Ibn al-Athir, did two enemies show such chivalry. They fought as lions, but they treated each other as brothers. By 1192, Richard's army had reached the outskirts of Jerusalem. From a hilltop, the king looked toward the Golden City, the walls, the towers, the domes. He dismounted, knelt, and wept. But he did not attack. The rains had come, supplies were low, and Saladin's forces still guarded every approach. Richard knew that even if he took Jerusalem, he could not hold it. Instead he sought peace. And Saladin too was weary. Years of war had drained his empire, and his dream of unity required stability, not endless bloodshed. And so, the two great warriors, one of the cross, one of the crescent, began to speak not as enemies but as men. Men who had seen too much of war, and who longed for the mercy of peace. The year is 1192. The deserts of Palestine lie quiet now, not in peace but in exhaustion. The cries of battle have faded into the sighing wind that moves through broken tents and abandoned siege engines. For almost 5 years, the Third Crusade has burned across the land like a fever. Saladin, the Sultan of Islam, stands upon a hill overlooking the plain near Jerusalem. His beard has grown white at the edges. His face, though calm, carries the weight of sleepless years. He has seen too much. Too many cities in flames, too many mothers weeping. And far to the west, in the camp of the Crusaders, Richard the Lionheart sits in silence, the golden light of dawn glinting off his armor. He too is tired. He too has lost brothers, friends, and dreams to this endless holy war. It is time for words, not swords. Messengers rode between the two camps under flags of truce. Letters were written, gifts exchanged. Both sides knew that victory, complete and final, was beyond reach. Saladin could not drive the Crusaders into the sea, and Richard could not storm Jerusalem. In those final months, the two greatest warriors of their age spoke across the field, not face to face, but through envoys who carried their respect, their frustration, and their humanity. Richard, proud but pragmatic, offered a proposal. Christians would not claim Jerusalem, but they would be allowed free access to the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Christ. Pilgrims could visit in safety, without fear or tax. Saladin listened. He smiled, a small weary smile, and agreed. For in his heart, the city was sacred to all who believed in God, no matter which name they used. The agreement was signed near the coastal city of Ramla, in September 1192. It became known as the Treaty of Ramla, the end of the Third Crusade. The terms were simple. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims would be granted safe passage to visit their holy sites. The Crusaders would retain a narrow strip of coastal territory, from Tyre to Jaffa. Neither side had truly won. Yet in that moment, both kings earned something greater than victory: honor. When the treaty was sealed, Richard prepared to depart for England. Before he left, he sent word to Saladin, asking if they might meet in person. Saladin declined gently. He feared that if they looked one another in the eye, he would not be able to part from such a man. Instead, he sent gifts, rare fruits, horses, and robes of honor. Richard, in turn, sent him a jeweled sword, crafted by English smiths. They never met face to face, yet their names would forever be bound together, the Lionheart and the Sultan. Enemies in war, reflections in spirit. When the Crusaders sailed home, the Holy Land breathed again. Saladin returned to Damascus, his capital, where the people greeted him with tears and flowers. He could have declared himself the greatest conqueror of Islam, but he did not. He lived simply, wore coarse clothes, and gave away most of his wealth to the poor. He refused luxury, even when his emirs begged him to rest and enjoy the rewards of rule. He would walk among his people in the bazaars, listening to their complaints, judging disputes himself. He rebuilt mosques and schools, repaired aqueducts, reopened trade routes, and ensured that Christian pilgrims were protected. In Jerusalem, the churches remained standing. The bells still rang. To his court he said, "The world is but a shadow. Our deeds are the light that will remain." In March 1193, only a few months after the peace with Richard, Saladin fell ill. It began as a fever, a small thing brought on by exhaustion. But within days, his strength began to fade. He called his sons and advisers to his bedside in the citadel of Damascus. The chroniclers tell that the great sultan lay upon a simple mattress, covered with a woolen blanket, with no gold or jewels in sight. When his treasurer came to account for his possessions, they found only a few silver coins, a Quran, and the clothes he wore. Saladin, who had ruled Egypt, Syria, and Arabia, died with less wealth than a common soldier. Before his death, he whispered a final prayer. "Make me humble before thee, O Lord, for all power belongs to thee alone." He was 55 years old. The city of Damascus wept. The people poured into the streets as the call to prayer echoed through the air. Even his enemies, the Crusaders who still held the coast, sent messages of mourning. Richard, when he heard the news, is said to have sighed deeply and said, "A great prince has passed away. He was the mirror of princes and the honor of our faith." Saladin was buried in a modest tomb beside the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. On his coffin, the muezzin carried a piece of cloth, his own banner, and proclaimed to the crowd, "This is all that remains of Saladin, the conqueror of kingdoms." Saladin's death did not end the Crusades. They would continue in waves for another century. But something changed after him. The age of blind hatred began to fade. In its place grew a grudging respect. Even in Europe he was admired. Poets and chroniclers wrote of his honor, mercy, and faith. In medieval France and England, his name appeared in romances beside King Arthur's knights, not as a villain but as an equal. And in the Muslim world, he became the shining image of the just ruler, firm but kind, powerful but humble, a man who believed that faith was not in cruelty, but in mercy. The sands of the Levant still carry his name. When the wind sweeps through the ruins of Acre or across the hills of Jerusalem, it seems to whisper, "Saladin, the bringer of justice, the restorer of peace." Listen, the wind that once carried the songs of crusaders now whispers differently through the stones of Jerusalem. The banners that once bore the Red Cross are tattered. The air is heavy, not only with the heat of late summer, but with centuries of prayer and blood. It is the year 1187, and Saladin stands before the walls of Jerusalem. He has crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and commanded armies that seem to move like waves of faith itself. Now, at last, he faces the city that had been torn from Muslim hands nearly 90 years earlier by the first Crusaders. The same city where, as legend said, rivers of blood once ran through its streets. And now, in a strange, poetic turn, it is Saladin's turn to decide the city's fate. Imagine the stillness before the first siege engines moved into place. The men of Saladin's army, Kurds, Arabs, Turks, Egyptians, standing in silence as the muezzin's call to prayer rose. Their armor glinted in the soft dawn light. For them, this was not just a conquest. It was a return, a sacred duty to restore Al-Quds, the holy city, to Islam. Jerusalem was defended by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few remaining Christian lords still loyal after the devastating defeat at Hattin. The garrison was exhausted, hungry, outnumbered, and without hope of relief. The Crusader kingdom had collapsed. There were no more reinforcements coming from the coast. Balian, noble and desperate, had only a few hundred knights left, and the terrified citizens behind the walls. Old men, women, and children who had nowhere else to flee. His engineers rolled forward great wooden towers. Arrows darkened the sky. Catapults flung stones that shattered against the limestone ramparts. The defenders replied with boiling oil and flaming projectiles. Each day, the sound of war was like thunder rolling endlessly, a grinding, echoing roar that filled the valley. But amid this fury, Saladin was calm. He rarely shouted. He spoke in low tones, giving orders like a scholar dictating from a text. To his men, his composure was divine. To his enemies it was terrifying. As days passed, a breach appeared in the wall, near Mount Zion, the southern edge of the city. Saladin's forces surged forward. The Crusaders held the line fiercely, even as their numbers dwindled. Women carried stones to the battlements, priests marched with crosses raised high, children filled buckets of sand to smother fires. Yet the end was near. Balian of Ibelin knew it. He climbed to the ramparts and looked out over the endless tents of Saladin's army, stretching like a sea of white and gold in the desert sun. He sought an audience with the Sultan, and here, in one of the most defining moments of medieval history, mercy met war. Balian came before Saladin under a flag of truce. The Sultan received him courteously, as was his way. Their meeting was conducted with honor. Balian spoke plainly. "If you take the city by storm, my lord, know that every man, woman, and child will die fighting. The streets will run with blood again, as they did when the Crusaders took it. But if you grant us terms, we will surrender peacefully, and you will gain the city without destruction." Saladin listened. His expression did not change, though his eyes grew softer. He remembered the tales of 1099, when Crusaders had slaughtered tens of thousands, Muslims, Jews, even Eastern Christians, in that same city. He could have sought revenge. The law of war allowed it. His soldiers, who had lost brothers and sons to the invaders, hungered for vengeance. But Saladin was not a man of vengeance. He was a man of balance. He agreed to spare the city, on one condition. Each citizen must pay a small ransom for freedom. The rich would pay more, the poor less. No one would be harmed, and those who could not afford ransom would still be freed. When the gates of Jerusalem opened, there was no massacre, no screaming, no smoke rising from burning houses. Instead, Saladin's men entered quietly, raising the green banners of Islam over the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The crosses were lowered, the crescent raised, but not desecrated, not destroyed. Balian handed over the keys of the city, and Saladin, the warrior, ordered that the Christian holy places be respected. He even allowed priests to remain to care for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Pilgrims would still be allowed to visit. For in Saladin's view, Jerusalem belonged not to one faith, but to God. The people of the city began to leave, slowly, in long, weary processions. Muslim guards escorted them safely to the coast. Some could not afford ransom, and for them Saladin's treasury paid the price. He freed thousands with his own wealth. Chroniclers, even Christian ones, recorded their astonishment. They called him a man of honor among infidels. They said that in his mercy, he showed a greatness not seen since the time of the prophets. Now close your eyes for a moment and imagine that day. The sunlight glinting on the golden dome. The chants of prayer returning to the Al-Aqsa courtyard after 88 years of silence. The sound of sandals on stone, as soldiers removed their armor and bowed to the ground. And among them Saladin himself, not seated on a throne, but kneeling in the dust, whispering his thanks to Allah. He had not come for gold. He had not come for power. He had come for justice. And that day, under the calm blue sky of Jerusalem, he achieved it, not with cruelty, but with compassion. The Crusaders had lost their greatest city. But in losing it, the world gained a new legend. Saladin, the man the West had feared, had become the measure of chivalry itself. And from that day, his name would echo through both Christian and Muslim lands, not as a tyrant, but as a symbol of honor. The year is 1189. The dust of Jerusalem's conquest has settled, but far away, in Europe, a storm is gathering. The news that Jerusalem, the heart of Christendom's devotion, had fallen to a Muslim sultan spreads like wildfire. In cathedrals, bells toll in mourning. In taverns, knights clench their fists and swear vengeance. And in royal courts, kings begin to whisper words that would soon ignite one of the most powerful crusades the world had ever seen, the Third Crusade. From the misty hills of France, the lion-hearted King Richard of England begins to prepare. Across the Channel, his rival yet ally, Philip II of France, gathers his men. And from the cold, disciplined courts of Germany, the old Emperor Frederick Barbarossa takes the cross as well. 3 kings, 3 armies, all marching east, to reclaim what they had lost. But in the desert lands of Syria and Egypt, Saladin waits, not with arrogance nor fear, with patience, like a falcon on its perch, watching the wind shift before the strike. Close your eyes. Imagine Damascus, that ancient city of gardens and domes. The air smells of rosewater and dust. In a quiet courtyard, beneath the shade of fig trees, Saladin sits with his advisors. His beard now carries threads of gray. The weight of rule and faith rests on his shoulders, yet his gaze is calm, steady, deep. Messengers come daily, reports of crusader fleets, armies assembling, kings crossing seas. His generals urge him to strengthen his walls, to prepare for the coming storm. But Saladin's voice remains soft. If they come, we will meet them as we have before, with courage, with unity, and with faith. He believes that victory, like patience, is a form of prayer. And so, in 1190 the Crusaders march. Across Europe, through the Balkans, over rivers swollen with rain. Frederick Barbarossa, the mighty emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, never reaches the Holy Land, drowned suddenly in a mountain stream of Anatolia. His army, leaderless, scatters like smoke. But Richard and Philip press on. Their ships land at the coast of Palestine, near the fortress city of Acre, a stronghold still held by the Crusaders, now besieged by Saladin's forces. The siege of Acre would last 2 long, merciless years. Listen carefully to the sounds of that siege. The whistling of stones launched by trebuchets. The cries of men digging trenches under the relentless sun. The low chanting of priests. The call to prayer from distant towers. And at night, the silence broken only by groans of the wounded. It was a contest of endurance. Saladin's army surrounded the city from outside, while the Crusaders within were starving. When Richard's fleet finally arrived in 1191, the sea itself seemed to bring thunder. The English king stepped ashore in shining mail, his sword flashing like a mirror in the sun. Richard, tall, fierce, a warrior born of legend, would soon become Saladin's equal, not in faith, but in honor. The fighting at Acre was brutal. Day after day, siege towers burned, ladders fell, men screamed. Disease spread, fever, thirst, hunger, devouring soldiers more swiftly than blades. And yet, amid this chaos, both leaders revealed their character. When Richard fell ill with a fever, Saladin, his enemy, sent him fresh fruit and snow from the mountains to cool his body. When one of Saladin's brothers was captured, Richard treated him as a guest, not a prisoner. These gestures passed between them like notes between poets, proof that even in the heart of war, nobility could survive. After nearly 2 years, Acre finally fell. The Crusaders stormed the walls. Saladin's garrison surrendered. But what followed would stain Richard's honor, at least for a time. The Sultan, unable to gather the ransom demanded for thousands of prisoners in time, watched in horror as Richard ordered them executed. More than 2,000 men slain outside the city walls. It was not vengeance. It was strategy to break Saladin's will. But Saladin did not break. His grief turned to steel. He vowed not revenge, but resistance. From Acre, the Crusaders marched south toward Jerusalem. Each step brought them closer to the sacred city. Each day, Saladin shadowed them, striking, retreating, testing, always watching. Their greatest battle came near the small coastal village of Arsuf in September 1191. The Crusaders, weary and marching along the shore, found themselves suddenly assaulted by Saladin's cavalry. Drums thundered. Horns echoed across the dunes. The desert wind carried dust and war cries alike. Saladin's men charged again and again, waves of horsemen sweeping across the sand. But Richard held firm, commanding with sharp precision. At the perfect moment, he unleashed his knights. Heavy cavalry crashing forward like a wall of iron. The battle was fierce but short. The Crusaders held the field. Arsuf was Richard's victory, yet even in defeat, Saladin's army remained intact. He withdrew methodically, refusing to let the war be decided by one clash. He was patient, disciplined, a master of the long game. That night, as the stars burned cold above the desert, Saladin looked out from his tent toward the horizon. He knew Jerusalem could not easily be held against such men, but he also knew the land itself would fight for him. The Crusaders, though brave, could not survive long so far from their ships. Their supplies dwindled. Their men fell sick. And perhaps most of all, they began to question whether they could ever truly hold a city sacred to all faiths, yet belonging to none. By 1192, Richard and Saladin began to negotiate. Two warriors, two men of faith, each weary, each still proud. Their letters were courteous. Their meetings, though through messengers, carried warmth. And when peace finally came, it was not with swords, but with words. The Treaty of Ramla allowed Christians to visit Jerusalem freely, though it remained under Muslim control. Pilgrims could come and go unharmed. The coast, from Jaffa to Tyre, would remain in Crusader hands. It was not the victory Richard had dreamed of, nor the annihilation Saladin could have sought. It was something rarer, a peace born of respect. When the Lionheart departed the Holy Land, he sent word to Saladin, "We may never meet again, but if it be God's will, I would have no worthier enemy, nor a truer friend." And Saladin replied, "There is no shame between brave men. May God guide you safely home." That is how the War of the Cross and Crescent ended. Not with destruction but with dignity. And even now, if you listen closely to the winds that cross the hills of Jerusalem, you might still hear the echo of two men who fought for faith and found honor instead of hatred. The war had ended, and for the first time in many years, the land of the Levant, torn, bled, and weary, began to breathe again. The soldiers returned to their tents. The swords cooled in their scabbards, and the sound of marching feet gave way to the quieter rhythms of prayer, of markets, of rebuilding. For Saladin, this was not a time for triumphal parades or lavish feasts. He had never been that kind of ruler. Even at the height of his power, ruler of Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and beyond, he lived simply. Small tent, a wooden bowl, a mat upon which he prayed. Those who served him said he owned no palace, no jewels, no fine horses beyond what he needed for war. His treasure was his faith. Now, with peace secured, Saladin returned to Damascus, his beloved city. It was spring. The gardens were alive with the scent of jasmine and orange blossom. Water murmured through the old stone channels of the Barada River, cooling the air. And in that city, old as time itself, the Sultan began to feel the weight of his years. He was only in his mid-50s, but exhaustion ran deep in his bones. For decades he had fought, not only battles of swords and banners, but battles of the heart, of loyalty, of faith. The strain of rule, the endless prayers, the ceaseless worries for the lands he had united. They had worn him thin. Yet he remained serene, a calm that radiated through all who came before him. Listen closely. The crackle of a fire in the dim chamber. The scent of ink and parchment. Saladin sits, writing letters, not of conquest but of gratitude. He sends gifts to scholars, to judges, to poor families in the city. He orders the release of prisoners who cannot pay their debts. Even in illness, his mind is steady, his compassion undimmed. One of his attendants, Baha ad-Din, records that when he tried to rest, the Sultan would instead rise quietly in the night to pray. Sometimes tears would streak his cheeks as he bowed his head upon the mat. "The world deceives us," he once said softly, "and when it departs, it leaves nothing but dust and bones." Then came the winter of 1193. A fever crept into the city. Silent, merciless. Saladin, already weakened, could not resist it. For days he burned with heat, his breath shallow. Doctors came, scholars prayed. Soldiers waited outside his door in silence. His sons stood by him, solemn, uncertain, still too young to carry the burden of the great empire their father had built. At moments, he drifted between waking and dreaming. He would whisper verses from the Quran, then fall quiet again, his hands trembling faintly. Once, he opened his eyes and looked at those gathered around him. "There is no God but Allah," he murmured, "and to him we return." In those final hours, he gave what little he still possessed to charity. When his treasurer came to list his wealth, there was almost nothing. No gold, no jewels. Just a single silver coin, a few dinars, a sword, and the robe he wore. The man who had commanded the richest lands of the East, who had stood against kings and emperors, died without enough money to pay for his own burial. His servants wept. They say that when he died, a herald walked through the streets of Damascus carrying his shroud high, crying, "Behold what Saladin leaves behind, nothing but this white cloth, in which he shall be buried." And so he was, quietly, humbly, laid to rest near the great mosque of Damascus. His tomb remains there still, a simple stone chamber. No gilded dome, no marble walls. Only his name carved upon a wooden plaque. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, the servant of God. If you visit, you will see two coffins, one stone, one wooden. The wooden one holds his true remains. The stone one was a later gift, from those who could not bear the thought that so great a man rested in such modest peace. But perhaps that simplicity was the truest reflection of him. Close your eyes now and imagine the city that day. The call to prayer echoing through the courtyards. The people lining the streets in silence. The flags lowered, the markets closed. Even the birds seemed to fall quiet. Men who had once fought for him, soldiers hardened by years of war, bowed their heads and wept. And among the Christians who still lived under his protection, candles were lit in his memory. For even they, his former enemies, called him just merciful, a man of honor. And as his body was lowered into the earth, a soft wind passed through the cypress trees. Some said it sounded like a sigh, the breath of a man who had carried the weight of empires, and now was free. After Saladin's death, his sons inherited an empire too vast to hold. Within a generation it began to fracture. Egypt here, Syria there. The unity he had built with his wisdom and patience could not survive the ambitions of men. But his spirit endured. In mosques and monasteries, in markets and schools, the people still spoke his name, not as a conqueror, but as Al-Malik al-Nasir, the victorious king who had ruled with compassion. And across Europe, his legend grew even larger. Richard's bards sang of him. Chroniclers in France and England wrote with admiration. Even centuries later, knights would say, "Fight with honor, as Saladin did." He became a bridge, between East and West, between enemy and ally, between power and mercy. And though his body rests beneath stone and soil, his story lingers, like the faint scent of jasmine on the air after a storm. The world did not fall silent when Saladin died, but it changed. The year was 1193, and though his heart had stopped beating, his name began to move, like a wind that travels across deserts, seas, and centuries. He had fought the fiercest of wars, yet left behind no cruelty, no empire of marble or gold. Instead, he left something far rarer, a legacy of honor. In Damascus, The call to prayer still rose each dawn, echoing through the courtyards and over the graves of the faithful. Pilgrims still came to the great mosque, and in one quiet corner they whispered his name, Saladin. Children grew up hearing stories of the Sultan who had defeated the Crusaders, but spared their lives. Merchants told tales of his fairness in trade. Scholars spoke of his piety, his love for learning, his gentle humor. He had not only won cities, he had won hearts. Across the seas in Europe, the stories took on another tone. The church had failed to reclaim Jerusalem, but even among its knights, there was a reluctant admiration, a reverence almost painful. How could a Muslim enemy embody the very ideals they claimed to cherish? Chivalry, mercy, courage, faith. Chroniclers like William of Tyre and Baha ad-Din wrote of him with equal awe, though from opposite sides of the war. Richard the Lionheart, long after returning to England, is said to have spoken of Saladin not as a foe, but as a brother in valor. And so, a strange thing happened. In the stories sung by troubadours and the poems whispered in castles, Saladin became a symbol, not of Islam, not of the East, but of the noblest image of knighthood itself. Close your eyes. Picture an old European hall, lit by torches. The fire crackles, the harp strings hum softly, and an aged bard tells his audience, "There was once a great sultan in the lands of the rising sun, who fought with courage and forgave with grace." Even the listeners, wrapped in cloaks, nod slowly. They know the name Saladin. They whisper it with the same tone they use for King Arthur or Charlemagne. A legend among legends. Meanwhile, in the East, his story lived differently. Not as a myth, but as a memory of unity. 4 generations after him, scholars and poets wrote of the time when the Muslims stood as one. Egypt and Syria, Kurds and Arabs, all bound by a shared purpose. They remembered the man who had not sought power for himself, but for the cause of justice, for the defense of faith, for the peace of the land. In Cairo, in Baghdad, in Aleppo, his name became a prayer. Malika Nasir Salah ad-Din. May Allah have mercy on him. But the centuries moved forward as centuries do. The Crusades faded into memory. Empires rose, fell, and were forgotten. Yet somehow Saladin remained. When Europe entered its Renaissance, painters and scholars rediscovered his name in old chronicles. Some imagined him as a philosopher king, wise and tolerant. Others painted him as a romantic figure, the noble enemy who might have been a friend, had the world been kinder. During the Age of Enlightenment, even Western writers, Voltaire, Gibbon, Scott, praised him as a model of reason and virtue in an age of fanaticism. And in the 19th century, when the Middle East once again stood in the shadow of Western powers, his name returned with renewed strength, a banner of pride, a memory of dignity. In Cairo, reformers spoke of his unity. In Damascus, poets wrote verses beneath his tomb. In Jerusalem, his story was told beside the Dome of the Rock, the same place he had once purified with his own hands. To every generation, he meant something slightly different. A warrior, a saint, a reformer, a dream. But in every telling, the essence stayed the same. He was the man who conquered without cruelty, who ruled without greed, who died without wealth, and who forgave without fear. If you listen closely now, not just to history books but to the spaces between them, you'll hear the quiet rhythm of his story still. In the calls to prayer that echo across Damascus at dusk, in the whisper of the Mediterranean breeze over Acre's ruins, in the footsteps of pilgrims walking the ancient stones of Jerusalem. His time has passed, but his presence lingers, not as a ghost, but as a lesson. History, after all, is not made of battles alone. It's made of how men choose to act when the world gives them power. Saladin had the power to destroy, yet he built. He had the right to revenge, yet he forgave. He had the chance to be feared, yet he chose to be respected. And that is why, after more than 8 centuries, his story still breathes, gently like the pulse of the desert wind. Close your eyes for a moment. You can almost see him again, a tall man in simple robes, his sword at his side, his gaze steady and kind. He turns toward Jerusalem one last time, and the light catches the edge of his armor like the glow of dawn. The city is peaceful, the call to prayer rises, and the Sultan smiles faintly, as if to say, "The world is not ours to keep. It is ours only to make better before we leave." The year was 1187. The sun rose over the hills of Judea, casting a pale gold light upon the ancient stones of Jerusalem, a city that had been conquered, liberated, and wept over by countless empires. But on that morning a new army surrounded her, an army led by the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin. The air trembled with the sound of hooves, the murmur of thousands of soldiers, the clinking of armor. Banners of green and white fluttered in the desert wind. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, once so proud and powerful, was now a flickering candle before a gathering storm. Inside the walls, panic spread like wildfire. Queen Sibylla and her husband Guy of Lusignan were gone, captured after the disastrous defeat at Hattin. The Holy Cross, once borne as a symbol of divine victory, had been lost. And now, the holy city itself lay naked before Saladin's might. But the Sultan did not come as a destroyer. He came as a man with purpose and restraint. At dawn, Saladin sent word to the defenders. His message was calm, almost merciful. "Surrender and you will be spared. Refuse and Jerusalem will fall, not to glory but to fire and ruin." The Christian commander, Balian of Ibelin, stood upon the ramparts, looking out at the endless sea of tents below. He knew the truth: they could not win. The walls were cracked, the garrison weak, the city filled with terrified refugees. Yet surrender was not easy, for this was the city of Christendom, the very heart of the Crusader dream. Still, Balian went to Saladin's tent. There, under the shade of the Sultan's great pavilion, the two men met, not as enemies, but as warriors who understood honor. Balian pleaded for mercy for the people of Jerusalem. Saladin listened in silence. His eyes, dark and reflective, held no hatred. He remembered Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo, cities where people of different faiths had once lived side by side. He would not stain his victory with blood. So he gave his word. Those who could pay a ransom might leave freely. Those who could not would still be spared. They would not be harmed or enslaved. It was an act that stunned the world. For when the Crusaders had taken Jerusalem in 1099, they had slaughtered its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants without mercy. Now, less than a century later, the Muslim conqueror returned, and showed compassion. Arrows rained down, siege towers creaked forward, and the walls trembled under the blows of catapults. The people prayed, wept, and waited for a miracle that would not come. At last, Balian raised the white flag. The gates of Jerusalem opened, not to fire but to order. Saladin entered the city with quiet dignity. There were no triumphal processions, no golden thrones, no gloating. He dismounted before the dome of the rock, removed his sandals, and entered barefoot, as a humble servant of God. The call to prayer echoed over the city once more. For the first time in nearly 90 years, the Adhan rose above Jerusalem's hills. The muezzins' voices trembled with emotion, carried on the wind to the ears of the Crusaders who stood watching in silence. It was a moment that felt like the closing of a circle. Under Saladin's orders, the Christian churches were respected. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained open to pilgrims. No man was forced to convert. No woman was harmed. And even the poorest who could not afford ransom were quietly released by Saladin's own charity. Chroniclers from both East and West would later write of that day. Muslim scribes praised Saladin's justice, calling him al-Malik al-Nasir, the victorious king. Christian chroniclers, though defeated, admitted his honor. In him, one wrote, the virtues of ancient chivalry were reborn. And yet, the peace could not last. Across the sea, news of Jerusalem's fall struck Europe like a thunderbolt. From Rome to Paris, from London to the Rhineland, church bells tolled and preachers cried out for vengeance. The cry was simple: Deus vult, God wills it. And thus began the Third Crusade. But in that moment, standing atop the city he had reclaimed, Saladin was at the height of his power. He had united the Muslims, humbled the Crusaders, and restored Jerusalem without the cruelty of conquest. And still he remained humble. When his generals asked how he wished to celebrate, he answered softly, "Praise be to Allah, who has granted us victory, yet kept us from arrogance." Outside the city walls, as the sun set, the camps of his soldiers filled with quiet murmurs and flickering fires. Some recited verses from the Quran. Others mended armor or wrote letters home. The smell of cooked barley and smoke drifted on the cool evening wind. And in his tent Saladin prayed, not for wealth nor for revenge but for peace. Because even then, deep in his heart he knew, the victory of arms was never the final victory. The real triumph was of faith and mercy. Winter settled over the Levant. The rains came down on the Holy Land, soft at first, then harsh and unrelenting. But beneath the grey skies and muddy fields, a storm was already gathering far away, across the Mediterranean. In Europe, the fall of Jerusalem had struck the Christian world like a wound to the soul. Pope Urban III, upon hearing the news, was said to have died of shock. His successor, Gregory VIII, wasted no time, issuing a passionate decree calling for a new crusade. Preachers poured into the marketplaces of France, England, and the German lands. They climbed onto barrels and church steps, their voices trembling with zeal. Jerusalem has fallen. The sepulchre of the Lord lies again in the hands of the infidel. Take up the cross, as your fathers did before you. And once more, the world began to move toward war. The kings of Christendom answered. From the west came Richard I of England, known to legend as Richard the Lionheart, tall, golden-haired, proud and fierce. From France came Philip II Augustus, cunning and methodical, a ruler of calculation more than passion. And from the heart of the empire, the aging Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, whose very name inspired fear, gathered his banners and marched toward the east. It was the greatest crusading host ever assembled. Men sold their homes, mortgaged their lands, and left their families behind for a chance to reclaim the city they had never seen but had been taught to worship since childhood. But even before they reached the Holy Land, the omens were grim. Frederick Barbarossa, leading his German army through the mountains of Anatolia, drowned while crossing a river. His death shattered morale. Thousands of his men deserted or died on the long march. By the time the survivors reached the shores of Syria, they were ghosts of the army that had once thundered across Europe. In the west, Richard and Philip sailed separately, each mistrusting the other. They were kings, yes, but they were also rivals. Behind their oaths of holy purpose lay envy, politics, and pride. Meanwhile, in the east, Saladin ruled from Damascus. He knew the Crusaders would return. It was only a matter of time. But he was not afraid. His confidence rested not in his wealth or armies, but in his unity. For he had done what no one before him could. He had brought the fractured Muslim world together under one banner. From Egypt to Aleppo, from the deserts of Arabia to the hills of Palestine, the call to prayer rose as one voice. He fortified the coast, repaired fortresses, and trained new soldiers. Yet there was something deeper in him, a melancholy awareness that the war would never truly end. When asked by one of his emirs if he feared the might of Europe, Saladin replied quietly, "The swords of the Franks are sharp, but they are wielded by hands that war against each other." And he was right. In 1191, the Crusader fleets finally reached the shores of the Levant. Their sails filled the horizon, hundreds of ships glittering under the sun. They landed near Acre, a port city that had already been under siege for nearly 2 years by the combined armies of the West. The siege of Acre became one of the most brutal and exhausting campaigns of the age. The heat was unbearable, disease spread like wildfire, and corpses piled along the walls. But neither side would yield. Saladin's forces surrounded the Crusader camp from the outside, while the Crusaders besieged Acre from within. Two rings of suffering locked together in endless struggle. From his tent, Saladin watched the distant towers of Acre with quiet patience. Every day he rode through his camp, speaking to the wounded, encouraging the young, praying with the scholars. He slept little, ate modestly, and gave away most of his treasures to the poor and the soldiers' families. Across the lines, Richard the Lionheart finally arrived. He came not like a pilgrim, but like a tempest. His armor gleamed like the sun. His banners bore golden lions that rippled in the sea wind. Wherever Richard rode, men followed, drawn by the force of his courage and the fire in his voice. He brought siege engines, ships, and supplies, and within weeks the tide began to turn. Philip of France, though weary and jealous, joined him for a time, and together their armies battered Acre's walls. Saladin countered with wave after wave of cavalry, launching daring raids, burning siege towers, and cutting supply lines. But the Crusaders were relentless. Finally, after months of blood and starvation, the defenders of Acre surrendered. The city's gates opened to the Crusaders, and Saladin, for the first time in many years, faced defeat. But even in loss, his dignity remained. He paid the ransom for his captured men. He treated enemy prisoners with honor. And when Richard executed Muslim hostages in retaliation for unpaid ransom, a dark and brutal act, Saladin did not answer with revenge. Instead, he ordered that Christian captives under his care be treated well. To one of his generals who urged him to retaliate, he said softly, "What honor is there in matching cruelty with cruelty?" As the summer sun burned the coastal plains, both men, the Lionheart and the Sultan, began to recognize each other. Not as monsters, not as demons, but as equals. Each was a mirror of the other, courageous, stubborn, and bound by a code that transcended hatred. They fought for different faiths, yet shared the same soul of chivalry. And in that strange reflection, a fragile respect began to form, one that history would remember long after their swords were sheathed. The summer of 1191 baked the land in relentless heat. The sky above the coast of Palestine shimmered, white and merciless, as two armies faced one another across the dry plain between the towns of Arsuf and Jaffa. On one side, Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, surrounded by his faithful emirs, his banners of emerald silk snapping in the hot wind. His cavalry, the flower of Islam, rode restless upon the sand, their curved blades flashing like waves in sunlight. On the other, Richard the Lionheart, the king who had crossed the sea for Jerusalem, his mail armor burning against his skin, his standards bearing 3 golden lions rippling above the ranks of crusaders. Both men knew this moment would decide more than a battle. It would decide who would rule the Holy Land, and perhaps who would be remembered as the true guardian of faith. The two armies had shadowed each other for weeks. Richard, after taking Acre, marched slowly down the coast toward Jaffa, his troops moving in tight formation beside the blue sea. His army was a living fortress, crossbowmen, foot soldiers, and mounted knights, each unit shielded by the next. Saladin's horsemen hovered like hawks, striking, retreating, striking again. Every day, their arrows hissed through the air like rain. Every night, Richard's men buried their dead in the sand. It was a test of endurance, a war of nerves. Saladin hoped to break Richard's line with fear and exhaustion. Richard hoped to lure the Sultan into a direct clash. On the morning of September 7th, their patience ended. The dawn came pale and silent. Mist hung over the dunes, and from afar, the sea whispered softly against the shore. Then at once the sound of horns, and the desert erupted. Saladin's cavalry struck like a storm. Thousands of horsemen, their robes flying, their lances glinting, descended upon the Crusader column. The sand rose in clouds, the earth shook beneath the hooves, and the cries of Allahu Akbar rolled like thunder across the plain. Richard's army tightened its formation. The infantry formed walls of shields, The crossbowmen crouched behind them, firing bolts that gleamed like silver sparks in the sun. The Muslim riders swirled around them, showering arrows from every side. The heat was unbearable. Men fainted beneath their armor. The sea glittered mockingly to their right, close enough to see, too far to reach. 4 hours the Crusaders endured. Saladin's plan was perfect: to exhaust them, scatter their formation, and strike when they weakened. But Richard held firm. He rode up and down the line, his voice carrying above the clash of metal. "Hold, my brothers! Hold the line!" His presence steadied them. His very figure, bright and defiant, became a living banner. At last, Saladin gave the signal for the killing blow. His elite cavalry, the Mamluks and Khwarezmians, surged forward, shouting, their scimitars raised high. They crashed into the Crusader flank with terrifying force. Dust and screams filled the air. Horses reared, men fell. The air was thick with sand and blood. For a moment the Crusader line bent, almost broke. Then Richard's voice rose again, with a command like thunder. He ordered the knights of the hospital and the temple to charge. The counterattack came like a hammer. Heavy cavalry roared forward, their lances leveled, their horses pounding the earth. They smashed into Saladin's riders, cutting through the first ranks with a weight of iron and fury. The sound was like the tearing of the world itself, the clash of east and west, faith and faith, flesh and steel. Saladin watched from a nearby ridge, his heart steady but his mind calculating. He sent wave after wave to stem the tide, but the Lionheart's charge had broken the rhythm of his battle. The Crusaders pressed forward, their cries of victory mingling with the crash of metal. Saladin's troops began to withdraw, not in panic, but in disciplined retreat. He signaled his lieutenants to regroup beyond the dunes. He had lost the ground, but not the war. When Richard's knights tried to pursue, Saladin's rear guard wheeled and struck again, a flash of control amid chaos. Even in retreat, his command was flawless. By evening the battle was over. The Crusaders held the field, but the price was heavy. Hundreds of men lay dead or dying, their armor torn and blackened. The smell of sweat, blood, and salt filled the air. Saladin's army withdrew into the interior hills, leaving the plain silent except for the cawing of distant crows. Richard, standing amid the wreckage, knew what he had achieved, and what he had not. He had won the day, but not broken the Sultan. Saladin's losses were real, yet his army remained strong, his spirit unshaken. The two men, separated by faith and fate, had tested each other, and found in one another an equal. Richard admired Saladin's grace in defeat. Saladin respected Richard's valor in victory. That evening, as campfires flickered across both camps, messengers rode between the two leaders, not with threats, but with gifts. Richard sent Saladin fine wine and snow from Mount Lebanon to cool it. Saladin, who did not drink, thanked him with a basket of fruits, horses, and robes of honor. In a world burning with hatred, two enemies had found something rare: respect. The chroniclers who followed them would later say that the Battle of Arsuf was more than a fight. It was a meeting of two civilizations. One bore the legacy of Christendom, the other of Islam. And though neither conquered the other, both proved the nobility of their cause through courage, not cruelty. When night finally fell over Arsuf, the fires burned low, and the moans of the wounded echoed faintly across the sands. Above them, the stars shone cold and bright, the same stars that had watched over prophets, kings, and wanderers before them. Saladin stood alone outside his tent, the cool night wind brushing his robe. He looked toward the horizon, toward Jerusalem, and softly he whispered a prayer. "O Lord, let peace come, even if it is not through me." The battlefields fell silent, but the war did not end. Between the blood and dust of Arsuf and the quiet walls of Jerusalem, there stretched a fragile thread, one woven not from victory, but from exhaustion. Both Saladin and Richard were men of iron will, yet even iron bends under weight. The Sultan's soldiers had been fighting without rest for years. Disease spread through his ranks, provisions ran thin, and the endless march of battle had hollowed even the bravest hearts. Richard's crusaders, too, were weary. The heat scorched their armor, the nights brought fever, and the long separation from their homeland gnawed at their spirits. After Arsuf, Richard moved south and took Jaffa, the coastal city that opened the road to Jerusalem. It was a victory of strategy, a door through which the Crusaders might strike the heart of Islam's reclaimed jewel. From the towers of Jaffa, the road to Jerusalem shimmered in the distance, winding through hills of olive and dust. To the Christian soldiers it seemed within reach. One last march, one final triumph. But Richard hesitated. He rode with his knights through the villages of Judea, feeling the sun-baked earth beneath his horse's hooves, the wind carrying scents of cypress and stone. He knew the land was deceptive, beautiful but cruel. Saladin had stripped it bare. Wells were poisoned, crops destroyed, and the fields made empty. The Sultan understood. Jerusalem could be taken by sword, but not held by thirst. Richard stopped his army near Beit Nuba, only 12 miles from Jerusalem. From the hilltops, his scouts could see the city's golden dome glinting on the horizon, and yet he turned back. In his tent that night, Richard confided to his advisors, "I cannot hold what I can conquer." For even if he captured the city, the Muslim armies would encircle him, and once he returned to Europe as he must, it would fall again, just as it had before. He was a warrior, not a fool. And Saladin, far away in his Damascus court, knew the same truth. So began one of the most remarkable exchanges in the chronicles of war. A dialogue between enemies who had learned to admire each other. Messengers rode between their camps, carrying not just threats but courtesies. Richard would send gifts of falcons, cloaks, and horses. Saladin replied with fruit, snow, and perfumes from Arabia. In one moment of legend, when Richard fell ill with fever, Saladin sent him a cooling drink of ice and pomegranate, and his own physician to tend him. It was a rivalry that had turned to respect. Even from across the desert, the two men seemed bound by a strange, wordless kinship. The chronicler Baha ad-Din, who served beside Saladin, recorded how the Sultan spoke of Richard. "He is a man of great courage and energy. Were he to rule in the East, he would unite the people under one banner." And in Richard's camp, a similar sentiment echoed. "There is not a nobler prince in the world than Saladin," one knight wrote in his diary, "nor a more courteous enemy." But beneath the surface of courtesy lay exhaustion and calculation. Both sides knew the war could not continue forever. Richard's army was shrinking. Many of his men were dead or ill. His ships were needed elsewhere. Saladin's treasuries were drained. His soldiers thin and weary. The dream of conquest was giving way to the reality of survival. So they began to speak of peace. The negotiations were cautious, delicate, a dance of pride and pragmatism. Saladin's emissaries came to Richard's tent at Jaffa. They spoke of terms. The Muslims would keep Jerusalem, but Christians would be allowed to visit freely. The coastal cities, Acre, Jaffa, and Tyre, would remain in Crusader hands. Richard agreed to discuss, but not to yield. He wanted more. Perhaps not the city itself, but something that would satisfy his men, his pope, and his pride. Days turned into weeks. Messengers rode back and forth. Every evening, the sound of drums from the Muslim camps drifted through the sea air. Every morning, the bells of the Crusader chapels answered from across the lines. Two worlds, divided by faith, joined by fatigue. Then came one of history's most poetic proposals. Richard suggested a marriage alliance. His sister Joan of England, a widow of royal blood, could be wed to Aladil, Saladin's brother. Together, they might rule Jerusalem in peace, uniting Christian and Muslim under shared governance. It was a vision ahead of its time, a kingdom of tolerance, guarded by love instead of walls. But it could not be. Neither the church nor the ulama, the Muslim scholars, could accept such a union. The world, in the 12th century, was not ready for peace born of such bold imagination. The proposal dissolved like mist. leaving behind only admiration and melancholy. And so, the war resumed one final time. In the summer of 1192, Saladin struck at Jaffa, catching the Crusaders by surprise. The city fell swiftly, and the cross once more trembled before the crescent. But then, as if fated, Richard returned from the north with his fleet. He leapt from his ship, sword in hand, rallying his men with the ferocity of a lion cornered. The battle that followed was fierce and chaotic. Men fought knee-deep in the surf, their blood mixing with salt and sand. Saladin's cavalry swarmed, Richard's knights countercharged, and in the chaos neither side gained ground. When the dust settled, the sea was red, and both armies lay shattered. And so, at last, the two men met again, not as conqueror and defender, but as weary rulers seeking rest. They agreed to a truce of 3 years and 8 months. Under its terms, Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims could visit the city freely and without harm. The Crusaders would keep the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. It was not the victory the West had dreamed of, nor was it the total triumph the East had hoped for. But it was peace, fragile, temporary, and precious. As their messengers carried the final seals of agreement, both men stood on their separate shores, Richard gazing west toward the sea, Saladin east toward Damascus, and knew that their duel was over. They had fought with swords and with honor, and in the end, each had won something greater than land, the respect of an enemy, and the admiration of history. The autumn winds began to cool the sands of Palestine. The war was over. The drums were silent. And for the first time in many years, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, could breathe without the weight of an army at his back. In Damascus, the muezzin's calls to prayer echoed over the domes and gardens of the city he loved most. The fragrance of jasmine drifted through the narrow streets, mingling with the murmur of fountains and the sound of shopkeepers calling to one another. Peace had returned. Not the peace of triumph, but the peace of fatigue, hard-earned and fleeting. Saladin returned home not as a conqueror, but as a man who had seen too much. He had stood before the gates of Jerusalem in victory. He had faced kings and knights from the farthest corners of the earth. He had seen oceans of blood, walls crumble, empires bend, and yet his heart remained soft, his faith unshaken. He had devoted his life to jihad, not just the holy war against invaders, but the inner struggle for righteousness, mercy, and humility. Now, in his last months, it was this inner struggle that defined him most. In Damascus, Saladin lived simply. The palace gates were open to the poor, the sick, the orphaned. He gave away gold freely to those who asked, often slipping coins into the hands of beggars at night, unseen. He wore coarse robes, ate little, and refused the lavish feasts his emirs tried to prepare. To one of his officers, who found him sitting on a plain carpet eating bread and olives, he said softly, "It is enough for me to eat as the poor eat, for I am their servant." His treasurer warned him that the royal coffers were nearly empty. Saladin smiled. "Then praise be to Allah, who has allowed me to die with nothing that could be stolen from me." The Sultan's health, however, began to fade. Years of war, nights without sleep, and endless travel through heat and storm had taken their toll. He grew pale, thin, and weak, but he continued to attend prayers, to hear petitions, and to meet his scholars. Sometimes he would walk alone through the gardens of the citadel, leaning on his staff, gazing toward the western horizon. He would whisper verses of the Quran under his breath, the words soft as the wind through the cypress trees. All things perish, save the face of Allah. There was no fear in his voice, only peace, the peace of one who had given his life to something greater than himself. One evening, when the stars were bright and the fountains still, he called for his sons and his closest companions. They gathered by his bedside, the flicker of oil lamps casting trembling shadows on the walls. Saladin looked at them one by one. His generals, his family, his scholars, men who had followed him through deserts and wars. His voice, though faint, was steady. "I have not left behind gold or silver. What I leave you are the prayers of the poor and the blessings of the oppressed." He paused, then added, "Be just, fear God, and never forget that power is a trust, not a gift." His attendants wept quietly, but Saladin smiled. He turned his face toward the Qibla, whispered the Shahada, and closed his eyes. He was 56 years old. The year was 1193. The news spread quickly. Across Damascus, Aleppo, Cairo, and Jerusalem, mosques were filled with mourning. The people, rich and poor alike, came out into the streets, some barefoot, some carrying candles, some clutching small copies of the Quran. The city wept, not only for a ruler, but for a man who had embodied mercy in an age of cruelty. When his attendants prepared his body for burial, they found only 1 dinar and a few silver coins in his treasury, all that remained of the wealth of an empire. Everything else he had given away. The funeral procession moved slowly through Damascus. The sound of recited prayers filled the air. Behind his coffin, one of his soldiers carried his sword and a simple banner of green silk, and another man rode with a small bundle tied to a spear. It was Saladin's shroud. The man cried out to the people, "Behold what the great Sultan takes from this world. Nothing but this cloth." The crowd fell silent, their hearts heavy with awe. The conqueror of Jerusalem, the hero of Islam, the man who had shaken empires, had gone to his creator with empty hands. He was buried in a modest tomb beside the great Umayyad Mosque of Damascus. There, his body rests to this day, covered by a simple marble slab and the fragrance of centuries. Visitors from across the world still come to stand before it, to whisper prayers, to remember the man who lived by faith and died in humility. The chronicler Baha ad-Din, who knew him well, wrote of that day, "Never did I see a man so loved in life, nor so mourned in death." And so, Saladin's story came to its quiet end. But his name did not fade. It lived on in the hearts of both friend and foe, in the east, as al-Malik al-Nasir, the just king, and in the west, as the noble enemy, the Saracen knight who honored his word and spared his foes. Even centuries later, European poets would write of him as the model of chivalry. Dante placed him in the first circle of paradise, among the virtuous pagans and men of wisdom. To Muslims, he remained a symbol of unity and faith. To Christians, a mirror of their own ideals. And to history, he became what few ever become. A conqueror remembered not for his wars, but for his mercy. The city of Damascus slept that night under a soft rain. The lamps of the mosques burned low, and the gardens breathed in the cool air of dawn. Somewhere, a lone muezzin climbed the minaret and called to prayer, his voice trembling with sorrow. The echo of his call drifted over the rooftops, over the tomb where Saladin lay, and rose into the endless sky. A reminder that even kings are but travelers through the world, and peace, not power, is the final home. When the dust of his funeral had settled and the last echoes of prayer faded through the marble halls of Damascus, the world did not forget him. In fact, in the silence that followed his death, Saladin's legend began to grow even larger than his life. The chroniclers who had followed him, men like Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani and Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, wrote down his deeds with trembling reverence. They had seen kings kneel before him, enemies praise him, and the poor bless his name. Their pens moved with tears, not ink. "He was the lamp of the age," wrote Baha ad-Din, "the sword of Islam, the mercy of Allah to the believers." His life became a mirror for rulers and a lesson for empires, that justice and compassion could exist even in war. After Saladin's death, his vast empire, stretching from Egypt to Syria, began to fragment among his sons and brothers. The unity he had forged through faith and discipline slowly unraveled. But his spirit remained. In Cairo, the Friday sermons invoked his name for decades. In Damascus, the imams would still say in their prayers, "May Allah bless the soul of the just Sultan, the defender of Jerusalem." Children in the markets grew up hearing stories of his victories, not as distant history but as living examples of courage and humility. Mothers named their sons Yusuf after him, hoping their children might grow to be just and brave. Even centuries later, when new conquerors rose, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, and beyond, they called upon Saladin's memory as the ideal Muslim ruler. One who fought fiercely but forgave freely. One who ruled the world but kept his soul uncorrupted. In Islamic literature, he became Al-Malik al-Adil, the just king. His name appeared beside those of the Prophet's companions, not for his prophecy, but for his character. Across the Mediterranean in Europe, the name Saladin took on a life of its own. In a time when Crusaders had painted Muslims as barbarians and heretics, Saladin shattered the image. The knights who returned from the Holy Land told a different story, of a man who treated captives with honor, who sent physicians to his enemies, who spared Jerusalem when he could have drowned it in blood. Richard the Lionheart himself, his fiercest rival, is said to have admired him more than many of his own lords. Medieval minstrels sang ballads of the two kings, not as enemies, but as equals bound by fate and respect. By the 13th century, Christian poets in France and Italy were writing of the gentle Saladin, a pagan blessed with Christian virtues. In the 14th century, Dante Alighieri placed him in the first circle of hell in the Divine Comedy, not as a punishment, but as a mark of honor, among the noble souls who were righteous yet unbaptized. Later, during the Age of Chivalry, European knights studied his conduct in war as the very model of knightly virtue. He became a mythic hero even in lands that had once marched to destroy him. As centuries passed, the world changed. Empires rose and fell. The Crusades faded into legend. But the name Saladin endured. When Napoleon marched into Egypt in 1798, he stood before the citadel of Cairo and asked his officers, "Tell me of this man, the Sultan who once ruled from here." When European scholars began to rediscover Arabic manuscripts in the 19th century, they found his story, not in a single chronicle, but in hundreds. His character leapt from the pages. Disciplined, merciful, brilliant, human. Writers like Sir Walter Scott immortalized him in novels, depicting him in The Talisman 1825, as a majestic figure, wise, gentle, and noble. That portrayal shaped the Western image of the Muslim hero for generations. In the 20th century, as Arab nationalism rose, leaders and revolutionaries looked back to Saladin as a symbol of Arab pride and unity. His statue was erected before the citadel in Damascus. His sword raised toward the sky. His steed frozen in bronze, forever riding toward Jerusalem. The inscription below reads simply, "Here stands Salah ad-Din, conqueror of Jerusalem." But beyond the myths and monuments, what truly survived was the idea of Saladin, the belief that power and mercy can coexist. That greatness lies not only in victory, but in restraint. He was a warrior who never killed for cruelty, a king who gave away his riches, a conqueror who forgave his enemies. In an age when the cross and the crescent clashed in endless bloodshed, he proved that faith could inspire compassion as much as conquest. Modern historians still study his life, not only for his strategy, but for the question he leaves behind. Can a man wield the sword and still keep his soul pure? Saladin's answer was yes. And in that answer, his immortality was sealed. Today, if you walk through the old quarter of Damascus, past the scent of spice and the hum of ancient fountains, you will find a small marble mausoleum beside the Umayyad Mosque. Inside, under a dome painted with verses from the Quran, lies the simple wooden coffin of Saladin. Beside it stands a later marble sarcophagus, a gift from Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who, upon visiting the tomb in 1898, ordered that a grand monument be built to honor the man even his ancestors had once fought. But the caretakers of the shrine still point to the plain wooden box and say, "Here lies the real Saladin, who lived as a king and died as a servant of God." Every year, pilgrims and tourists, scholars and soldiers, step quietly into that room. Some whisper du'as, others bow their heads in silence. And in that silence, across faiths and centuries, the memory of the Sultan breathes on. Salah ad-Din's story does not end in 1193. It continues wherever justice, mercy, and faith stand together against hatred. He remains, a bridge between civilizations, a warrior who became a legend, and a legend who became a lesson. The man who once reclaimed Jerusalem now rules only the hearts of those who remember that true victory lies not in conquest, but in compassion. And as history turns its endless pages, one name glows eternal among the empires of dust. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, the Sultan who defeated the West and conquered the world with mercy. The centuries that followed Saladin's death transformed the world beyond recognition. The swords of crusaders were long rusted, the castles crumbled, and the banners of kings were buried under dust. Yet somehow the memory of one man endured. From the mosques of Cairo to the lecture halls of London, the name Salah ad-Din still carried a quiet power, not merely as a hero of the past, but as a symbol, a question, a living idea. By the 19th century, Europe had begun to look back on the Middle Ages not with rage, but with fascination. Writers, poets, and painters turned to the age of knights and sultans, seeking romance among the ruins. And among those ruins, they found Saladin. When Sir Walter Scott published The Talisman in 1825, his portrayal of Saladin changed Western imagination forever. Gone was the image of the barbaric Saracen. Instead, Scott wrote of a noble monarch, gentle, wise, brave, almost saintly. In his novel, Saladin disguised himself as a physician to tend to the wounded King Richard. And the two men, enemies by faith, discovered a bond of mutual honor. The story was fiction, but its heart was truth. Europe, weary from its own wars and revolutions, found comfort in this idea, that even in conflict humanity could prevail. Painters followed suit. In canvases that hung in Paris and Vienna, Saladin appeared not as a savage conqueror, but as a chivalric ruler. His robes shimmering in gold, his eyes calm with wisdom. The West had found in him a reflection of its ideal knight, clothed in Eastern silk. While the West romanticized him, the Muslim world reclaimed him. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Arab world was awakening from centuries of colonial rule. Empires, Ottoman, French, and British, cast long shadows over the Middle East. In this era of identity and struggle, Arab thinkers sought figures who embodied both dignity and independence. They turned to Saladin. In Cairo, scholars of Al-Azhar preached of him as the restorer of unity. In Damascus, poets called him the defender of faith and homeland. To the Arab world, he was not merely a medieval warrior. He was the answer to a question that still haunted them. Can unity return to the Muslim lands? His story became a quiet form of resistance, a reminder that foreign occupation had once been defeated, and that justice had once been defended not with hatred, but with courage and mercy. In 1948, when the State of Israel was created and Jerusalem once again became a city of conflict, Saladin's name was spoken on every street corner in the Arab world. He became a symbol of hope, a voice whispering from the 12th century to the 20th. The city has fallen before, and it was reclaimed. The 20th century gave Saladin new forms, not through scrolls and poems, but through microphones, cameras, and cinema. In 1963, the Egyptian filmmaker Youssef Chahine released Al-Nasr Salah ad-Din, a sweeping, colorful epic that turned Saladin into a cinematic hero. The film was more than art, it was political. Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser saw himself mirrored in Saladin's role, a leader uniting the Arab world against Western powers. Audiences across Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus wept as they watched the Sultan raise his sword before Jerusalem's walls. In every frame, Saladin's image burned like prophecy, the dream of unity reborn in the age of radio and television. Even in Western cinema, his figure persisted. In 2005, Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven reintroduced Saladin to a global audience. Played by Syrian actor Ghassan Massoud. He was calm, dignified, and deliberate, a man who spoke softly even as empires burned. When he entered Jerusalem in that film, he lifted a fallen cross from the floor of Al-Aqsa Mosque and placed it gently back upon the altar, a gesture of respect that spoke across religions. It was not just a cinematic moment. It was the echo of history. For those who had read the chronicles knew that the real Saladin had done the same. But modern historians, in their quiet libraries, have worked to see beyond the myths. They ask, who was the real man behind the marble statue and silver screen? They find contradictions. A ruler both generous and shrewd. A man capable of mercy yet hardened by war. He was not the saint that legend paints, nor the perfect hero. He was human. He executed spies. He punished betrayal. He ruled through discipline as much as faith. But what made him remarkable was his self-control. In an age of vengeance, he chose restraint. In an age of greed, he died poor. And in an age of ambition, he thought always of the divine. Modern scholars such as Carol Hillenbrand and Amin Maalouf note that his greatness was not only in war, but in how he ended it. He sought peace where others sought glory. He restored not just Jerusalem's stones, but its sanctity, allowing Jews, Christians, and Muslims to live together once more. That vision, fragile, fleeting but real, was the seed of a world that might have been. Today, the name Saladin adorns streets, schools, hospitals, even football clubs across the Middle East. In Iraq, there is Salah ad-Din province, his birthplace and namesake. In Pakistan, Indonesia, and Malaysia, universities bear his name as a symbol of enlightened leadership. In literature, he continues to appear, a timeless ghost walking through the corridors of culture. His image is invoked by leaders and rebels alike. To some, he represents unity, to others, righteous resistance. But perhaps what endures most is his balance, the rare harmony between strength and mercy. In every generation that struggles with war and faith, Saladin reappears, not as a conqueror, but as a question that never fades. Can power serve peace? In modern Western thought, Saladin stands among a handful of figures who bridge civilizations. He is studied in military academies for his strategy, in theology for his tolerance, and in diplomacy for his restraint. In a world fractured by misunderstanding between East and West, his story reminds both sides that history has seen cooperation before, that respect is not weakness, and mercy is not surrender. The Christian chronicler William of Tyre, who lived through the Crusades, once wrote reluctantly of him, "Among the infidels, there was none more just or more merciful." Centuries later, in classrooms from Oxford to Cairo, that same sentence still stirs debate. A testimony to the Sultan who became larger than creed or kingdom. Perhaps no other figure from the Crusades stands in both worlds at once. To Muslims, he is a saintly warrior. To Christians, a noble foe. To historians, a moral paradox. To filmmakers and dreamers, a symbol of hope. But between all these versions, one truth remains constant. Saladin's greatness lay not in what he conquered, but in what he refused to destroy. And as long as the world still remembers the pain of war and the longing for peace, his name, whispered across centuries, will not fade. The centuries rolled forward, empires changed their names, and yet, among the scholars and philosophers of the Islamic world, the name of Salah ad-Din continued to be spoken not merely as history, but as a lesson, a moral compass, a living example of what leadership could mean when guided by conscience. When the chronicles of kings were filled with blood and betrayal, Saladin's pages shone with something else: restraint, mercy, and purpose. He was, as many later scholars would write, a ruler of the heart as much as the sword. Saladin's worldview was born not in luxury, but in service. Before he was a sultan, he had been an ordinary soldier, a young man studying under imams, learning the Quran, and listening to stories of the Prophet. From these early teachings came his conviction that power was a trust, an amana, not a privilege. To Saladin, leadership was a form of worship. It was to be exercised in humility, not arrogance. He often quoted the hadith, "The leader of a people is their servant." This belief shaped his every act of rule. He treated his soldiers like brothers, his scholars like mentors, and his people, even those of other faiths, as souls entrusted to his care. He fasted when they went hungry. He prayed with them when they grieved, and when he stood before Jerusalem's walls. His victory was not one of hatred, but of duty. That spiritual grounding, so rare among rulers, would become the cornerstone of his legacy. In Islamic philosophy, justice, adl, is the spine of governance. Saladin embodied this principle so deeply that even his enemies acknowledged it. He established courts in every major city of his empire, not to collect taxes or punish dissent, but to ensure that no one, not even a noble, could wrong the weak. Chroniclers record that he personally heard petitions from peasants, and once delayed a military campaign until a widow's case was resolved. His vizier once questioned his decision to spend hours on a trivial matter of property. Saladin replied quietly, "How can I expect victory in war if I am unjust in peace?" That sentence, carried through generations, became a maxim of Islamic leadership. Later rulers across the Muslim world, from the Mamluks to the Ottomans, kept his sayings in their manuals of kingship. Even Ibn Khaldun, the great historian and philosopher, cited Saladin as a model of the ideal ruler in his Muqaddimah. He who balances mercy with authority, and power with humility, walks the path of the Sultan of Islam. Saladin was not a scholar himself, but he revered knowledge as sacred. He built libraries in Cairo and Damascus, endowed madrasas, and surrounded himself with jurists, poets, and physicians. In his court, faith and intellect did not war against each other. They walked side by side. He welcomed debates between the ulama and the philosophers, seeing them not as threats, but as nourishment for the mind of a nation. The chronicler Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani wrote that Saladin listened to scholars, as one thirsty listens to a well. He believed that ignorance was the first enemy of Islam, not the crusader's sword. And so, while he built fortresses, he also built schools. While he sent armies to battle, he sent scholars to teach. It was this harmony between piety and reason, between prayer and strategy, between Quran and inquiry, that made his reign not only powerful, but enlightened. Saladin's philosophy of life can be summed up in a single paradox. He conquered the world, yet was never conquered by it. His tents were plain, his meals modest. Even as Sultan, he slept on a straw mat. When his treasurers complained of his generosity, he smiled and said, "Wealth is a guest, it does not stay long." He gave away most of his possessions during his lifetime, and when he died, not enough gold remained in his treasury to pay for his burial. But it was not poverty that defined him, it was detachment, the ability to hold power without being held by it. That, perhaps, was the greatest lesson his life offered to kings and commoners alike. When Richard the Lionheart once sent him a rare gift, snow packed in jars from the mountains of Lebanon to cool his fever, Saladin returned the gesture with fresh fruits, horses, and medicine. It was more than diplomacy, it was grace. A silent declaration that victory means little without virtue. In Saladin's world, vengeance was the law of the land. Tribes feuded for generations. Kings answered insult with massacre. But Saladin broke that cycle. When he entered Jerusalem in 1187, many of his generals urged him to do what the Crusaders had done in 1099, to slaughter and cleanse the city by the sword. He refused. "The city of prophets," he said, "must not be purified with blood." Instead, he offered safe passage to all Christians who wished to leave, and allowed those who stayed to worship freely. That decision shocked the world. It turned enemies into admirers, and transformed conquest into compassion. To Saladin, forgiveness was not weakness. It was a higher form of power, the kind that reshapes history without staining it. Saladin's battlefield ethics became legend. He forbade looting, respected prisoners, and treated envoys with honor. Before the Battle of Hattin, he ordered his men to give water to the captives, saying, "They too are God's creation." To his soldiers, he was both commander and conscience. He reminded them before every campaign, "Do not fight for me, fight for what is right." This moral discipline was not born of fear, but of faith, a reflection of the Prophet's words that, "The greatest jihad is against one's own self." And in that internal war, the war of restraint, mercy, and dignity, Saladin was undefeated. Centuries later, thinkers such as Muhammad Abdu and Iqbal would invoke Saladin's name as the embodiment of Islamic humanism, a model of leadership where knowledge, justice, and compassion were inseparable. Iqbal, in his poetry, saw in him not just a ruler of the past, but a spirit, a symbol of what the Muslim world could become if it found again the balance between faith and reason. Even modern ethicists in the West study Saladin's life as a rare example of moral warfare, the art of fighting without losing one's humanity. Saladin's vision was not confined to a century or an empire. It was a universal truth, whispered through time. That real power is not domination, but discipline. Not fear but fairness. Not conquest but character. His words and deeds survive not just in history books, but in the unspoken ideals that guide every act of integrity. Whenever a leader shows mercy instead of revenge, whenever a soldier spares the helpless, whenever faith becomes a bridge instead of a barrier, there quietly Saladin lives again. The sea wind moaned like a tired animal against the tents of Acre. Flags, red, gold, white, whipped in the salt air, carrying with them the heavy scent of sweat, blood, and the endless sea. The year was 1189, and the city of Acre had become the beating heart of the Third Crusade. It was here that kings, knights, and peasants from both worlds, east and west, would clash under the hot Mediterranean sun. Saladin stood on a low rise beyond the siege lines, his gaze steady on the enemy's camp. The Christian forces had gathered in frightening strength. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Leopold of Austria among them. Each led banners shimmering in the daylight, their tents bright with silk and embroidery, their weapons polished to blinding brilliance. But beneath that grandeur lay rot, mistrust, greed, jealousy. Saladin could feel it, sense it, almost smell it. The Christians were united in banner but divided in heart. Still they were formidable. The siege of Acre dragged on and on. 2 long, brutal years. Saladin's army encircled the Crusaders to keep them from spreading further inland, while the Crusaders surrounded Acre to starve out its defenders. Between these 2 circles of death, the land became a graveyard. By day the air shimmered with heat. By night it trembled with groans. Arrows hissed like snakes. Catapults creaked, slinging great stones into the city walls. When one side managed to repair a breach, the other tore it open again. Famine came first, then disease. The once verdant coast turned grey with corpses, both Saracen and Frank alike. And through it all, Saladin prayed. Every evening, after he had walked through the lines and spoken to the weary soldiers, giving bread to the poor, water to the wounded, he would retire to his tent. There, the sound of the sea was like a living thing outside the canvas. He would spread his mat, face Mecca, and bow low. His voice, calm and deep, carried softly through the wind. He prayed for patience, for guidance, for mercy on the souls of all men caught in this endless struggle. But Richard prayed too, for victory, for vengeance. The 2 men had not yet met, but already they were bound by fate. As the siege dragged into its 2nd year, Saladin's supplies thinned. His horses died in the fields. The roads to Damascus and Cairo grew dangerous as Christian ships ruled the sea. The siege of Acre became not only a test of strength, but of endurance, of will. In the camps, rumors spread like wildfire. They said Saladin never slept, that he could be in 3 places at once, tending to the walls of Acre, visiting the sick, and commanding battles miles away. In truth, he hardly rested. He rode from dawn until after sunset, keeping his soldier spirits alive with his quiet faith and steady composure. When one of his emirs begged him to rest, Saladin simply smiled and said, "A man may sleep in the grave, but while I breathe, there is work yet to do." Inside Acre's walls, the Muslim garrison held firm. They sent desperate signals to Saladin, smoke by day, fire by night, begging for aid. But his own men were exhausted. Each attempt to break the siege met with heavy loss. And so, for months, Saladin played a grim game of patience. He attacked suddenly, retreated deliberately, fainted, and vanished. His strategy was not to crush Richard's army, but to wear it thin, to let hunger and heat do his work for him. Still the Franks persisted. Their siege engines grew larger, their assaults more desperate. And then, in July 1191, the walls of Acre finally cracked. When the defenders surrendered, they did so on the promise of mercy, a promise sealed by solemn oaths between commanders. The terms were simple. The garrison would yield the city, and in exchange, Saladin would pay a ransom for the captives and return the true cross, the sacred relic taken years before at Hattin. Saladin agreed. But then Richard arrived. The Lionheart was not a man of patience. His strength lay in action, not diplomacy. The ransom was delayed. Negotiations stalled. Tempers rose. And one hot afternoon, Richard made a fateful decision. He ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, men, women, and children. They were marched from the city in chains, bound together beneath the blazing sun, and slaughtered on the plain. When word reached Saladin, he stood silent for a long time. The men around him watched as his face, calm and composed, turned pale with sorrow. He did not shout. He did not curse. He whispered, "What they have done God sees. What we must do He will judge." Then, quietly, he turned to his commanders. "Prepare the men," he said. "Tomorrow we ride." The vengeance of Saladin came not in fury, but in precision. His archers rained arrows upon the Crusaders' supply trains. His cavalry harried them day and night, vanishing like smoke into the hills. Slowly, methodically, he bled Richard's army as it moved south along the coast. Each village they passed was empty, its wells filled with sand. The road became a corridor of silence and fear. And through it all, the Lionheart and the Sultan waged a war not only of arms, but of endurance and of respect. For though they fought as enemies, they recognized something noble in each other: courage, honor, and restraint rare among kings. Saladin's men began to call Richard Malik Ankabut, the Spider King, for his cunning and reach. And Richard's soldiers whispered of Saladin the Just. 2 warriors, 2 worlds, 1 destiny. And somewhere between the clash of their armies and the prayers of the night, history paused, holding its breath. The summer of 1191 burned across the Holy Land like a fever. The sea shimmered like molten glass. The air trembled with heat. After the fall of Acre, the Crusader army, weary but triumphant, began its long march south toward Jerusalem. And in the shadows of the hills, Saladin watched. He rode among his men with quiet vigilance. His armor was plain, his banner white. To the weary soldiers who looked up as he passed, he seemed less like a sultan and more like a monk of war, calm, restrained, utterly focused. The defeat at Acre had not broken him. It had tempered him like steel in fire. Richard's army was immense, a procession of banners and steel stretching from the sea to the inland ridges. English, French, Flemish, Templars, Hospitallers, an army of tongues and tempers. The coastline glittered with ships bearing supplies from Europe, while inland, Saladin's scouts moved like ghosts through the valleys, striking, vanishing, striking again. At dawn, mist rolled in from the sea. The Crusaders marched in silence, their armor damp with salt and sweat. And often, from the distant ridges, came the faint, haunting sound of drums, Saladin's drums, echoing through the empty hills. It was not only war that Saladin waged. It was patience, precision, and presence. On September 7, 1191, the armies met. The Christians marched close to the sea, their flanks guarded by the waves. Saladin's forces descended from the inland hills in waves. Cavalry, archers, light infantry. Thousands of men moving like water, swift and deadly. The sun hung high, white and merciless. Arrows filled the air like rain, thudding into shields, flesh and sand. The noise was a living thing, a roar of metal and breath, of hooves striking earth, of men shouting prayers to God and Allah alike. Saladin rode among his ranks, calling his soldiers by name, urging calm, discipline, courage. His voice was low but carried far, as if borne on the wind itself. The Christians, pressed hard, began to waver. Then suddenly Richard struck. The English king, enormous and fearless, led a countercharge of knights that split through Saladin's front line like lightning. The clash of iron against iron echoed across the plain. Saladin's cavalry regrouped swiftly, surrounding them, striking at their flanks, but Richard's disciplined formation held. When the dust settled, the field was littered with the dead of both faiths. Arsuf was no true victory for either side, a battle drawn in valor and exhaustion. Saladin withdrew, his army bloodied but unbroken. Richard advanced, but cautiously, knowing the enemy he faced was no ordinary man of war. For months, the two armies danced across the Holy Land, the Christians pressing forward, Saladin harrying them from every side. Villages were taken, abandoned, retaken. Caravans burned, wells poisoned, fortresses besieged and abandoned again. But always Jerusalem lay ahead, the city of gold and stone, the heart of every prayer, every crusade, every dream. Saladin knew the city better than any man alive. He had prayed beneath its domes, walked its narrow markets, watched the sunrise over the Mount of Olives. To him, Jerusalem was not merely a place. It was a trust, a sacred gift. And now he knew the Lionheart meant to take it. As winter came, the rains began, heavy, relentless. The camps became rivers of mud. Soldiers grew sick, horses died. Saladin's men wrapped themselves in coarse wool and endured, murmuring verses by the fires. Richard's troops, cold and ill, huddled beneath leaking tents, longing for home. Yet, through misery and weariness, a strange respect began to grow. Stories spread across the lines, of Saladin sending fresh fruit and snow to cool Richard's fever, of Richard sparing captured Saracens in admiration of their courage. Two great enemies, bound by the same code of honor, facing each other across a land soaked in blood. In one tale, true or not, no one could say. When Richard's horse was slain in battle, Saladin sent him two of his finest Arab steeds, saying, "A king should not fight on foot." Such gestures did not end the war, but they softened it, turned it from a crusade of hate to a contest of souls. By the spring of 1192, Richard's strength was fading. His army was smaller, his supplies dwindling. He reached the hills near Jerusalem, close enough to see its towers glimmering in the distance. The city lay quiet beneath a pale dawn. The dome of the rock shone like a jewel. The olive groves shimmered in silver mist. Richard halted there. He could have marched forward, could have laid siege to the holy city, but he did not. He knew what it would cost. He knew that even if he took Jerusalem, he could not hold it. Behind him lay a weary, starving army. Ahead of him, a strong city, defended by faith as much as by walls. And so, in that still morning light, the Lionheart turned back. Saladin, watching from afar, understood. Their final negotiations took place that summer. Letters passed between them, written with courtesy and warmth. Two warriors who had fought fiercely now spoke like brothers who shared the same weariness of bloodshed. They agreed to peace, a truce that would last for 3 years and 3 months. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands. But Christian pilgrims could visit the Holy Sepulchre freely and safely. It was not victory for either side. It was balance. It was respect. When the treaty was sealed, Richard sent envoys to Saladin's tent. And though they never met face to face, history remembers their friendship as one of the rarest bonds in the age of Crusades. Two men divided by faith, yet united by honor. When Richard finally sailed away, Saladin stood on the walls of Jerusalem. The wind brushed through his beard. The sun was low, bathing the city in gold. He did not celebrate. He did not boast. He whispered instead, "Praise be to God who gives and takes, who humbles kings and raises the dust of the poor." And as the muezzin's call rose over the quiet hills, the world seemed for a moment at peace. The sound of the muezzin still echoed faintly across the plains of Jerusalem when Saladin turned from the city walls for the last time. It was the year 1192. The long wars were over. The Lionheart had gone home, and peace, fragile, trembling, precious, had settled over the Holy Land like the first snow of winter. Yet, in Saladin's eyes, there was no triumph, only quiet weariness. He returned first to Damascus, the city he loved more than any other. The road wound through olive groves and broken fields, once red with blood, now green again with the coming spring. Everywhere he rode, people came out from their homes, old men, children, women in simple veils, calling his name. They threw flowers before his horse, not for conquest, but for mercy. Saladin had not only saved Jerusalem for Islam, he had restored something more fragile, dignity. To the people, he was not just the Sultan. He was al-Malik an-Nasir Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the just king, the defender of the faith, the man who had fought, forgiven, and endured. But the years of battle had left their mark. He was not an old man by number, barely in his 50s, but he walked with the slow care of someone far older. His hands trembled when he reached for a cup of water. His voice, once clear and steady, had softened into a whisper. He spent his days walking through the markets of Damascus, quietly observing the life that thrived because of his peace. He would stop to speak with merchants, to smile at children, to listen to scholars reciting verses in the mosques. Often he was seen giving away coins to beggars, not gold, for he had little left, but silver from his own purse. One afternoon an aide approached him and said, "My lord, your treasury grows thin. You have given too much." Saladin looked at him and replied gently, "What I keep will perish with me. What I give will endure." In the evenings, as the sun fell behind the hills, he would retire to his chamber overlooking the orchards. There he would pray long, unhurried prayers that carried into the dusk. Sometimes he wept softly, not from pain, but from gratitude. He would speak of Jerusalem, not of its battles, but its silence at dawn, the call to prayer echoing through its stones, the scent of the olive trees in the morning wind. It was not ours to take, he once said, only to protect. As months passed, illness crept upon him. His strength waned. His appetite faded. Physicians came and went, bringing herbs, oils, prayers. But the Sultan's body was weary from the burden of years in the saddle, from nights without sleep, from fasts, from endless marches across deserts and battlefields. In his final days, Saladin called for the recitation of the Quran to be constant in his room. The verses filled the air like a gentle river. He gave away what little remained in his possession: his clothes, his horse, his sword, his coins. When the treasurer came to record the items for the inheritance, there was barely enough to pay for his burial. The man who had once ruled from Egypt to Mesopotamia, who had commanded vast armies and negotiated with kings, died without a single gold coin to his name. On the morning of March 4, 1193, the city of Damascus woke to a strange stillness. The palace courtyard was silent. The guards stood motionless, their eyes lowered. Inside, the Sultan lay upon a simple mat, his face serene, his hands folded across his chest. A faint breeze moved the curtain beside him, carrying the scent of jasmine and dust. The voice of a muezzin rose softly in the distance, calling the faithful to prayer. And in that quiet hour, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, returned to his creator. The people of Damascus wept. The streets overflowed with mourners. From every mosque, the imams recited prayers for the Sultan's soul. Christians and Jews joined the Muslims in mourning. Even in the distant courts of Europe, kings bowed their heads. Richard the Lionheart, upon hearing the news, is said to have whispered, "A prince without equal in faith and honor." They buried Saladin near the great mosque of Damascus, in a simple tomb he himself had chosen. Above his resting place, a short inscription was carved. "Here lies Salah ad-Din, who united the Arabs, took Jerusalem, and showed mercy to his enemies." Beside the tomb, for centuries after, a single green flag fluttered, not the banner of conquest but of peace. In the years that followed, the world changed. Empires rose and fell. The Crusades continued, then faded into dust. But Saladin's name remained, whispered in prayers, sung in stories, remembered by both East and West. To the Muslims, he was the ideal ruler, brave, humble, faithful. To the Christians, he became a paradox, the noble enemy, the warrior who embodied the very chivalry they claimed as their own. His legacy outlived his empire. His mercy outshone his sword. And his story, the story of a man who fought for faith yet never lost his humanity, became a candle in the long corridors of history, still glowing faintly in the hearts of those who believe that even in war, there can be honor. The night settles softly over Damascus. The lamps in the old streets flicker, their glow trembling against the worn stone walls. Somewhere in the distance, a single flute plays, its sound low, slow, almost like a prayer carried by the wind. And in the quiet heart of the city, beneath the shadow of the Umayyad Mosque, lies the tomb of Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin. The air inside is cool, the marble cold beneath your feet. When you stand before that resting place, you feel something unusual. Not grandeur, not power, but peace. Centuries have passed since his time. The kingdoms he defended have changed. The banners he raised have long turned to dust. Yet still, his name is spoken with reverence. In mosques, in monasteries, in quiet corners of history books. Saladin was more than a warrior. He was a bridge between worlds. To his own people he was al-Nasir, the helper, the one who restored faith and unity. To his enemies, he was a mystery, a man of war who prayed for peace, who conquered but forgave, who stood unshaken where others sought glory. He showed that true strength is not the sword drawn in anger, but the hand extended in mercy. Imagine him now, walking once more through the gardens of Damascus. The scent of orange blossoms drifts through the night. The stars shimmer faintly above the desert sky. His robe, once heavy with dust and sweat, now seems to ripple like soft silk in the moonlight. His face, calm and aged by wisdom, carries no shadow of pride, only stillness. He pauses by a fountain, its waters murmuring in the dark. He kneels, touches the cool surface, and whispers, "All that I was belongs to God." Then the water stills, and silence remains. We remember Saladin not only for the cities he won, but for the hearts he touched. When he took Jerusalem, there was no fire, no slaughter, no revenge. He opened the gates and said to its people, "You are safe. Your faith is safe. Your homes are safe." In an age when cruelty was the language of kings, he spoke in kindness. In a world that burned with division, he built understanding. His greatness did not end on the battlefield. It began after the battle, when the blood had dried and mercy took its place. Now let us draw a slow breath together. In and out. Again. In and out. Let the sound of your own breathing take you backward, beyond this room, beyond this century, into that far golden age. You are standing on the walls of Jerusalem at dusk. The city glows beneath the fading sun, domes turning to amber, minarets tall and still. Somewhere below, the faint chant of evening prayer rises, mingled with the toll of distant bells. This is the world Saladin left behind, a world bruised by war but still capable of beauty. He believed that God's mercy could bloom even in the cracks of ruin. And perhaps he was right. When the Crusaders spoke of him in Europe, they did not call him the infidel. They called him the noble enemy. Chroniclers wrote that no knight of Christendom could match his generosity, that when he could have crushed his foes, he chose compassion instead, that when kings mocked his poverty, he smiled and gave his last coin to the poor. Such stories are rare in history. They are the whispers that survive after the shouts have faded, and it is those whispers that define him still. Tonight, if you listen closely, truly listen, you can almost hear his story carried on the desert wind. The clatter of hooves has long gone silent. The banners have fallen, but the echo remains, steady, timeless, gentle. It says, "Power fades, empires fall, but kindness endures." So, as we end our journey through the life of Saladin, take one last deep breath. Feel the calm wash over you, like the cool air of Damascus at dawn. Let the noise of the modern world drift away, until only the rhythm of your heart remains. Imagine the stars above his tomb, shining as they did 900 years ago, each one a witness, each one a memory, and whisper softly to yourself, "Peace be upon the one who fought with courage, and ruled with mercy, and left this world with empty hands." Now open your eyes. Slowly. The story is over, but his spirit, gentle, steadfast, eternal, still walks quietly through the corridors of time. Sleep now, traveler of history. Rest as Saladin rests in peace.